The scent of my grandmother's famous pot roast filled the dining room, but I could barely taste the food on my plate. Across from me, Derek's voice cut through the warm family atmosphere like a blade through silk, each word carefully chosen to slice just deep enough to hurt without drawing blood that others could see. "Sarah's always been the dramatic one," he said with that practiced smile that fooled everyone except the two people who mattered most, my 4-year-old son Tommy and me. "Remember when she thought she could be a writer? Still waiting for that bestseller. Aren't we, sweetheart?" The laughter around Grandma's mahogany table felt like needles against my skin. My family, people who were supposed to protect me, joined in with the kind of nervous chuckles that come when you're not sure if something's funny but everyone else seems to think it is. But Tommy wasn't laughing. My little boy sat in his booster seat, his wide blue eyes moving between his father and me with an intensity that made my chest tight. At 4 years old, he understood things that adults chose to ignore, saw truths that grown-ups had trained themselves not to see. Derek's mockery had become our family's dinner entertainment, a twisted tradition that everyone had learned to accept as just Derek being Derek. But tonight felt different. Tonight, the air was thick with something more than the aroma of home-cooked food. Tonight, my son was about to change everything with 3 simple words that would shatter the carefully constructed illusion my family had been living in for years. 2 years ago, I thought I'd found my Prince Charming. Derek Morrison was everything I'd been told to want: successful lawyer, charming smile, the kind of confidence that filled a room and made people listen when he spoke. When he proposed after 6 months of whirlwind romance, my family was thrilled. Finally, Sarah was settling down with someone worthy. What they didn't see were the small cruelties that started almost immediately after our wedding. The way he'd correct my stories at dinner parties, making me sound foolish. How he'd dismiss my dreams of writing as cute hobbies while building his legal career. The subtle ways he undermined my confidence until I began to question my own memories, my own worth. But it was when Tommy was born that Derek's true nature emerged. A baby's needs didn't fit into his perfectly controlled world. My exhaustion from sleepless nights became laziness. My struggle with postpartum depression became weakness. My fierce protection of our son became overreacting. "You're being too sensitive," became his favorite phrase, delivered with that patronizing tone that made me feel like I was losing my mind. And somehow, he'd convinced my family that I was the problem, the unstable new mother who couldn't handle the pressures of marriage and motherhood. Tonight's dinner at Grandma's house was supposed to be a celebration of Tommy's 4th birthday, but Derek had already turned it into another opportunity to showcase my inadequacies. He'd started with small jabs about the birthday cake I'd made from scratch. "Store-bought would have been fine, Sarah. You don't have to prove anything," and escalated to questioning my parenting choices in front of everyone. "She reads him too many books," he told my mother with a laugh. "Kid's going to grow up thinking the world is all fairy tales and happy endings. Someone needs to prepare him for reality." But as Derek continued his performance, I noticed something that chilled me to the bone. Tommy had stopped eating. He was watching his father with the kind of focused attention that seemed far too mature for a 4-year-old. His small hands clenched into fists on either side of his plate. The conversation had moved to my failed attempts at freelance writing, and Derek was in his element, regaling the table with stories of my unrealistic expectations and childish dreams. My grandmother, usually my fiercest defender, was nodding along with a concerned expression that broke my heart. "She spent 3 months on that children's book," Derek said, cutting his meat with theatrical precision. 3 months! And when no publisher wanted it, she locked herself in the bedroom and cried for days. I had to take care of Tommy while she had her little breakdown. The truth was more complicated, as it always was. I had cried not because of rejection, but because Derek had deliberately sabotaged my submission by sending it to publishers with a cover letter that made me sound unprofessional and desperate. I'd only discovered this weeks later when one editor called to ask if I was feeling better and mentioned the strange letter that had accompanied my manuscript. But I'd learned not to defend myself at these family gatherings. Derek was too skilled at twisting my words, making me sound paranoid or unstable. It was easier to sit quietly and endure, to protect what little credibility I had left. That's when Tommy's small voice cut through the adult conversation like a bell through fog. "Daddy lies." The words were so quiet, so matter of fact, that for a moment I thought I'd imagined them. But the sudden silence around the table told me everyone had heard. Derek's fork paused halfway to his mouth, his practiced smile flickering for just an instant. "What did you say, buddy?" Derek's voice was still warm, still controlled, but there was something underneath it now, a warning that made my stomach clench. Tommy looked directly at his father, those blue eyes holding a steadiness that seemed impossible for someone so young. "You lie about Mommy. She doesn't cry because she's sad about books. She cries because you're mean to her." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Every adult at the table suddenly found their food fascinating, unwilling to meet anyone's eyes. But Tommy wasn't finished. The silence that followed Tommy's words was deafening. I could hear the grandfather clock in the hallway ticking, the soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the sound of my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. Derek's face had gone through a series of micro-expressions: surprise, anger, calculation, before settling back into his practiced mask of amused tolerance. "Kids say the darndest things," he said with a forced chuckle, but his eyes were cold as they fixed on Tommy. "Someone's been watching too many movies, haven't you, sport?" But Tommy didn't back down. If anything, he seemed to grow more determined, his small chin lifting in defiance. "I'm not lying. You make Mommy scared. You make her hands shake when you talk loud." My heart broke and soared simultaneously. My baby boy, my 4-year-old son, was doing what I'd been too afraid to do for 2 years. He was telling the truth. But I also knew what this meant. Derek didn't tolerate challenges to his authority, especially not in public. The consequences would come later, when we were alone, when there were no witnesses to his carefully controlled rage. "Tommy, sweetheart," my mother said gently, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation had taken. "Daddy and Mommy sometimes have grown-up discussions. That's normal in families." "No," Tommy said, his voice getting stronger. "It's not discussions. Daddy says mean things to make Mommy feel bad. And then Mommy cries in the bathroom where she thinks I can't hear." The accuracy of his observation hit me like a physical blow. How many times had I retreated to the bathroom after one of Derek's verbal assaults, thinking I was hiding my tears from my son? How long had Tommy been watching, understanding, carrying the weight of our family's dysfunction in his small heart? Derek's mask was slipping now. I could see the anger building behind his eyes, the way his jaw tightened when he felt his control slipping. He was calculating his next move, trying to regain the upper hand without revealing too much of his true nature to my family. But Tommy wasn't done, and what he said next would change everything. Derek leaned forward slightly, his voice taking on that dangerously quiet tone I knew too well. "Tommy, that's enough. You're being disrespectful to Daddy, and you're upsetting Grandma and everyone else. Apologize right now." The threat in his voice was unmistakable to me, but to my family, it probably sounded like reasonable parental discipline. This was Derek's genius. He could deliver threats that sounded like guidance, intimidation that looked like leadership. But Tommy didn't apologize. Instead, he turned to look at each adult around the table, his gaze lingering on my grandmother, my mother, my father, my uncle. When he spoke again, his voice carried a clarity that seemed to come from somewhere far beyond his for years. "Why don't you help Mommy?" he asked, and the question hung in the air like an accusation. "Why do you let Daddy be mean to her? Don't you love Mommy?" The adults shifted uncomfortably in their seats. My father cleared his throat. My mother reached for her water glass with trembling fingers. My grandmother's eyes filled with tears that she quickly blinked away. They all loved me. I knew that. But they also lived in a world where keeping peace was more important than confronting uncomfortable truths. "Tommy," Derek's voice was sharper now, the mask slipping further. "I said that's enough. You're going to your room when we get home, and we're going to have a serious talk about respect." That's when something shifted in the room's atmosphere. The threat was too obvious now, too clear for even the most willfully blind adults to ignore. Derek had just threatened a 4-year-old for telling the truth, and everyone had heard it. Tommy's lower lip began to tremble, but not from fear, from frustration. from the weight of being the only one brave enough to speak the truth that everyone else could see but chose to ignore. "I don't want to go home," he whispered, and then louder, "I don't want to go home with Daddy. He hurts Mommy with words. He makes her scared all the time." Derek's chair scraped against the hardwood floor as he stood abruptly, his control finally snapping. "That's it. We're leaving. Now. Sarah, get your things. Tommy, you're in serious trouble." But as Derek moved toward Tommy, something extraordinary happened. My son looked up at his father, tears streaming down his face, and said the words that would shatter everything. "Stop hurting Mom." The words exploded from Tommy's small chest with a force that seemed to shake the very foundations of the house. But it wasn't just the volume that made everyone freeze, it was the raw, desperate pain in his voice, the sound of a child who had been carrying an adult's burden for far too long. Every spoon, every fork, every hand holding a glass stopped midair. The silence that followed was so complete it felt like the world had stopped spinning. Derek stood frozen beside Tommy's chair, his hand still reaching toward our son, his face a mask of shock and barely contained rage. But Tommy wasn't finished. The dam had burst, and years of carefully observed truth came pouring out. "He calls Mommy stupid when you're not here," Tommy said, his voice breaking but determined. "He says she's ugly and nobody else would want her. He throws her books in the trash and says she's wasting time. He makes her say sorry for things that aren't her fault." Each word hit the room like a physical blow. I watched my family's faces transform as the carefully constructed illusion of my marriage crumbled before their eyes. My mother's hand flew to her mouth. My father's face went pale. My grandmother's eyes filled with tears that she no longer tried to hide. "And when Mommy tries to tell you," Tommy continued, turning to look at my mother, "he says she's lying and making things up because she's sick in her head. But she's not sick. She's scared." Derek's voice, when it came, was barely controlled. "You little don't." The word came from my grandmother, quiet but carrying the authority of her 82 years. She stood slowly, her arthritic hands gripping the edge of the table, and fixed Derek with a stare that could have melted steel. "Don't you dare say another word to that child." The power dynamic in the room shifted so suddenly it was almost audible. Derek, who had commanded every family gathering for 2 years, found himself facing the matriarch of a family that was finally seeing him clearly. "Tommy," my grandmother said gently, never taking her eyes off Derek, "come here to Grandma." My son scrambled down from his booster seat and ran to her, wrapping his small arms around her legs. She placed a protective hand on his head and continued staring at Derek with an expression I'd never seen before, pure righteous fury. "Sarah," she said, her voice steady as granite, "pack your things. You and Tommy are staying here tonight. And tomorrow, we're calling a lawyer." Derek's composure finally shattered completely. "You can't just I can and I will." My grandmother interrupted. "This is my house, and I'm telling you to leave. Now." My father and uncle stood simultaneously, their message clear. Derek looked around the table at faces that had once welcomed him, that had once laughed at his jokes and admired his success. Now they looked at him with disgust, with shame for their own blindness, with protective fury for the woman and child they'd failed to defend. "This isn't over," Derek said, his voice low and dangerous. Tommy looked up at him with those wise blue eyes and said simply, "Yes, it is." And somehow, we all knew he was right. 6 months later, I sat at that same mahogany table, but everything had changed. The divorce papers were final, the restraining order was in place, and Derek was nothing but a memory that grew fainter with each passing day. Tommy was laughing at something my uncle had said, his face bright and carefree in a way I hadn't seen since he was a baby. The custody battle had been brutal, but Derek's own arrogance had been his downfall. When he tried to paint me as an unstable mother in court, Tommy's child psychologist testified about the emotional abuse my son had witnessed. When Derek claimed I was lying about his behavior, my family, led by my fierce grandmother, testified about what they'd seen that night at dinner. Children see truth differently than adults, the psychologist had explained to the judge. They haven't learned to rationalize away abuse or make excuses for unacceptable behavior. When a 4-year-old says someone is hurting his mother, we should listen, The judge had listened. Tommy would spend supervised visits with his father until Derek completed anger management and parenting classes. I had full custody and the freedom to rebuild our lives without fear. My grandmother reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "I'm sorry we didn't see it sooner," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm sorry it took a baby to show us what we should have seen all along." "He's not a baby anymore," I said, watching Tommy help my mother set the table for dessert. "He's the bravest person I know." That night, as I tucked Tommy into bed in my grandmother's guest room that had become our sanctuary, he looked up at me with those wise blue eyes. "Mommy," he said, "are you happy now?" I thought about the question, about the fear that had lifted from my shoulders, about the future that stretched ahead of us bright with possibility. "Yes, sweetheart," I said, kissing his forehead. "I'm happy now." Sometimes it takes the voice of a child to shatter the silence that protects the guilty and imprisons the innocent. If this story touched your heart, if you've ever felt trapped by someone else's version of reality, remember this: truth has a voice, and sometimes it speaks through the most unexpected messengers. Children see what adults choose to ignore, and their courage can light the way to freedom. Subscribe and share this story with someone who needs to hear it today. There are families out there living in silence, and stories like this might just give someone the courage to speak their truth. Because sometimes the smallest voices carry the most powerful messages.